Hey everybody, this is MightyNifty from New Year's Day. As you could probably tell, my voice is a little messed up, and that's because I got COVID. So that explains why the video is a little late. I'm going to wait until I get better, re-record it, and get this video out as soon as possible. Thank you all for your patience, and I hope you enjoy the video. Okay, it's a week later, I'm nearly healed, let's get going. You know, I've heard through the online grapevine that some consider 2021 to be a bad year for games, and I couldn't disagree more. While there were massive disappointments like Call of Duty and Battlefield, and the industry was exposed to the disgusting harassment taking place at Activision Blizzard and other major publishers, the rest of the year was pretty great overall. That's where this list comes in. I played a decent number of games this year and had an absolute blast, so for the fourth year in a row, I'll be ranking them from worst to best. Not in terms of quality, just by my opinion. That said, I wasn't able to play everything, so don't be surprised if your favorite games aren't on the list. I've heard amazing things about Hitman 3, Loop Hero, Guilty Gear Strive, Death's Door, No More Heroes 3, Metroid Dread, Inscription, Forza Horizon 5, Shin Megami Tensei 5, Halo Infinite, and so many more. But I'm one man who's short on time turners, so plenty of great games had to be left out. On the bright side, I did get to replay the God of War prequels for the retrospectives, learn guitar with Rocksmith, and tried out some other great games for the first time, like The Witness, Hollow Knight, Ratchet & Clank 2016, and Psychonauts to put a dent in the backlog. But that's beside the point. Right now, let's focus on a fantastic year of gaming. This is my ranking of every game I played in 2021. It Takes Two is a game that I wish could be on this list more than any other. At the time of recording this video, my partner and I have made it about a third of the way through that game and had a blast the entire time. It's not just a co-op game, it's a bonding experience and one that brings you closer to your co-op partner, unlike any game I've played before. The creativity in its gameplay never ceases to amaze me, and everything about it feels like it was made with love and passion. As of right now, if the game continues to be as good as it has been through the introduction, it would undoubtedly be my game of the year. But it's definitely too soon to call, so for now, all I can really say is that you have a partner, a roommate, a friend, or someone you want to spend more time with sharing new experiences and smiling the whole way through, go pick up It Takes Two as soon as possible and thank me later. Do you like the other Jackbox party packs? You'll probably like this one too. 5 new games, great for parties and streams, you know the deal. Now, onto the actual list. Alright, hear me out. I understand that My Friend Peppa Pig is made for toddlers. I did play it as a joke, specifically to throw into this video. I thought I could pop it in between number 1 and 2 just to get a chuckle. However, after playing it, I'm convinced that anyone of any age that interacts with this stupid pig will suffer permanent brain damage. I was a toddler at one point, I played Tigger's Honey Hunt and other children's games, but this is pathetic. $40 for a point-and-click walking simulator that has buggy screen transitions, poorly synced speaking animations, and slow walking speeds, which, by the way, are a necessity because otherwise this massive 1 hour long game would be a paltry 20 minutes. And of course, that's on top of the already existing issues with Peppa Pig, not least of which is the worst art style for an animated show I've ever seen. No lessons, no games, barely any interactivity. If you see a child playing this game, the only thing I can recommend is calling CPS. Introvert, a teenager simulator, is difficult to pin down. On the surface, it's a story about being the new kid in town and making friends with the other new kid. He says if he doesn't make friends in the first 5 days, he'll shoot up the school. after which you're able to explore the small town and make the occasional decision to change how things play out. The game is free, and the art style and music are great, plus the town has a few cool nooks and crannies to explore. Unfortunately, the controls are slow, there are a lot of bugs, and the decision-making system is both lacking and too vague. The game seems so preoccupied with being cool and unique that it forgets to really say or do anything with any of its concepts, and the core message is really muddied with all of the abstraction, making all of the artsy imagery devoid of purpose. And a story about a school shooting is definitely the wrong place to be so vague. It seems like the Euphoric brothers have made a few of these free pixelated lo-fi games, so they're probably just getting their footing in game development. They definitely have potential, so let's hope that when they really put their effort into a bigger project, they're able to better utilize the talent that they've already displayed. I'm not the biggest Pac-Man fan that you'll meet. The original arcade game is fun enough for a couple of rounds, but it never really held my attention for too long. As such, Pac-Man 99 didn't stand too much of a chance of getting higher on a list of my personal favorites. The latest entry in the retro arcade game Battle Royale genre, Pac-Man 99 tasks players with being the last one standing in a round of the classic arcade game with some new twists on the formula. Here, players are able to attack one another by sending ghosts to their opponent, as well as utilize strategies taken from the Championship DX games that allow players to devour dozens of ghosts in seconds. The only major problem I have with the game is that it doesn't properly explain the mechanics, but that's a pretty big deal. Without understanding the fundamentals of how the Battle Royale elements of the game work, this just becomes yet another game of Pac-Man with some flashy lights. The game's free with a Nintendo Online subscription, so if you like Pac-Man, it's definitely something to check out, but those like me who see the game as a novelty probably won't get much enjoyment here. In My Shadow is the first game from Indian developer Playbay, and you'd be forgiven for thinking it's a sequel to last year's Shady Part of Me. It's yet another puzzle game in which you manipulate 3D objects to arrange shadows in a way that allows a 2D shadow character to finish the level. The main differences here being the level-to-level structure rather than sequential story, the lack of a 3D character, and the litany of bugs. For the most part, In My Shadow is competent. The puzzles can be tricky, but fair. However, the 2D platforming is far too robotic, with no adjustment for your jump height. The still images between levels range from passable to creepy looking, with a bland story and repetitive soundtrack. And the puzzles can be glitchy, with obstacles having hitboxes larger than their sprites, and collision detection sometimes allowing for clipping, resulting in players asking themselves whether they found a solution that's broken, or if their answer is wrong. It's disappointing because there's a lot of potential here, it just lacks the polish necessary to really recommend it. Destruction All-Stars is one of the biggest disappointments I've played in a long time. It's a game with potential through the roof, but it fails on nearly every front to be anything more than a generic multiplayer experience. It just seems like for every great element the game has to offer, something else takes it down a notch. The character designs, art style, and graphical fidelity are all fantastic, but the skins are just boring recolors with no significant changes. The menus are static and take a long time to navigate. The concept of hopping in and out of cars is cool, but running on foot is clunky and doesn't have much utility in a match. The car combat is a stellar evolution of Twisted Metal, but the power-ups aren't unique enough between characters, handling can be a major issue, and some characters just feel useless. And for some reason, there's no music while actually playing a match. The only track I remember is the endgame recap screen, and that's just because it's the Uncharted theme song. Seriously, give it a listen. The gameplay modes are fun and unique, but there are hardly any players around. Hell, I still haven't played Gridfall despite trying about a dozen times to get into a match. And while that could be caused by it being a PS5 exclusive, the game itself should have been delayed until some basic features were added, so it's really on them. And of course, worst of all are the egregious microtransactions. Now, I'm no Sterling, I think a $60 game can absolutely have microtransactions and loot boxes as long as it provides $60 value. Overwatch being a solid example. Destruction All-Stars, on the other hand, was originally going to charge $70 for an unfinished game with what is now a dead player base, and then on top of that charge even more money to play the game's mediocre single-player challenges. Locking gameplay behind a paywall when you're already planning to charge $70 for the game is absolutely disgusting and something I cannot support. If the game winds up going free to play for everyone, it's worth giving a try, and I hope the developers can figure out a way to fix its many flaws, but in the end, Destruction All-Stars is a massive disappointment and a waste of a talented development team. Cloud Climber is a 10-minute long indie game in which the player walks around a few massive towers and learns about the circumstances surrounding their construction. Honestly, I hesitate to mention this game on any ranking because it's more like a tech demo for the developer to practice their skills than anything else, but it did make me intrigued enough to check out their other work. If you've got 10 minutes to kill, there's worse ways to spend it, especially since the art style is really cool. If nothing else, I'll keep my eye on 2-star games in the future. The idea of having a game shift between 2D and 3D perspectives is one that's been explored a few times in the past, but perhaps no game utilizes this mechanic so thoroughly as 2D and Top D. At first glance, 2D and Top D is a puzzle game in which the player must move objects around in both 2D and 3D spaces, switching between characters to progress through various levels, with different worlds each containing their own unique mechanics. However, the game doesn't stop there, it's also a platformer. While solving many of the game's puzzles does take smarts, they also require quick reaction time and precise jumps to avoid enemies, make jumps, and defeat bosses. The combination works really well, and when it's topped off with the game's silly meta humor, it can be a lot of fun. However, not everything gels together perfectly. The platforming controls can be incredibly stiff, and the game's default difficulty only allows players to take one hit before dying, which could be seen as a fair, if relatively difficult challenge during the boss fights, but since the game doesn't have a rewind feature like Baba Is You or other contemporary puzzle games, a simple mistake in later stages can require players to repeat minutes of setup over and over again until they get the right solution. While the player could expand their hit points in the menu, that results in many of the puzzles having an easily cheesed solution. It's disappointing because 2D and Top D is at its best when it sticks to being a puzzler, but the boss fights and platforming sections are brimming with creativity and are incredibly unique. It's still a fun time, but one with a lot of frustration along the way. More than anything, the game serves as a solid foundation that the developer can expand upon in their next outing to really bring out this concept's true potential. So apparently, 12 minutes is all the time it takes to get a disappointing ending. Okay, maybe that's a little harsh, so let me explain. 12 minutes is one of the many time loop games you'll see on this list. It revolves around a man returning home from work and talking to his wife until a stranger comes to the door and demands information from them. From there, the game tasks the player with escaping the loop by discovering the truth about what's going on. At first, the game was a lot of fun, a classic point-and-click puzzle game centered around the same few minutes looping over and over. Most of the puzzles have tricky but understandable solutions, though a few can be obtuse. The music sets the tone really well, and the voice acting is a delight, with the likes of Willem Dafoe, Daisy Ridley, and James McAvoy making up the cast. The animations do occasionally blend together or have an awkward execution, and sometimes the controls can be annoying, but for the most part, the first hour or so of this game is extremely promising. Then the game continues. After a certain point, the game becomes more about cycling through dialogue options during the various loops until reaching the correct set to learn more. It becomes extremely tedious, and that's only exacerbated by the contrived ending. Not only is the means of getting there nonsensical, but the result is wholly disappointing, making little to no sense given what we've come to understand. Even after the questions have been answered, there's still more required to make the credits roll, leading to an even greater disappointment. It's frustrating that such a promising, enjoyable puzzler ends with such a contrived conclusion, focusing more on subverting expectations and being artsy than actually satisfying the player's curiosities. Maybe this type of game could be attempted again, but 12 minutes itself is just pretentious writing in way over its head. Is Balan Wonderworld a good game? Absolutely not. If I had reviewed it, I'd have given it a score of 5 out of 10. The beginning is slow, the story is non-existent, the design is tedious and frustrating at every turn, the grinding is mind-numbing, there are way too many useless costumes, glitches can be a major issue, the co-op is some of the worst I've seen in a 3D platformer. I don't recommend that anyone goes out to buy this game. Except for a small subset of weirdos like me. See, while Balan Wonderworld has a whole host of issues that make it incredibly frustrating for the majority of people, when you get past those terrible opening chapters and start to really understand what the game was going for, you begin to see some incredibly inspired choices that could have worked really well with a lot more development time, something I made a whole video about just last month. The character designs and music are fantastic, and Wonderworld may be my favorite game soundtrack of the year. Not every costume is a winner, but they are often creative, and if not useful, at least kinda funny. Some of the level concepts are incredibly imaginative, like the MC Escher style art world or the void of the man that no one could see. The animations in-game might not be all that great, but the stylized introductory cutscenes to each character are well made, and I even found myself invested in a few. Look, I know Balan isn't going to get a sequel, but I really feel like that's a shame. While it has a lot of flaws both in concept and execution, it's an incredibly charming game that undeniably had a lot of passion behind its development. And while again, I cannot recommend it to almost anyone in good conscience, if you absolutely love 3D platformers, have a burning curiosity to figure out exactly what Balan Wonderworld is all about, and can find it in a bargain bin for about $5, you may wind up finding yourself having fun from time to time. When I first picked up Knockout City, I was expecting the usual, EA's yearly attempt to find the next big thing in online multiplayer before someone else, with a new gimmick and bare-bones features accentuated by a store full of cosmetic microtransactions. Last year's Rocket Arena was a half-baked, RPG-based third-person shooter that left a bad taste in my mouth by pushing the microtransactions so hard. Knockout City pretty much does the same thing, but at least it's fun and unique. The name of the game is Dodgeball, with players able to use a variety of balls around each arena to knock out their opponents. But while Rocket Arena was a typical third-person shooter with rocket launchers, the dodgeball mechanics are really well thought out. Players can catch balls that have been thrown at them with sharp timing to prevent a hit, shoulder check opponents off the map or out of a ball, navigate the maps with their wide variety of terrains and mechanics, and even use their teammates as a ball for an even more powerful shot. It's not really a major innovation, but it's enough to create a new and unique experience with creativity and passion clearly put into its development. While it's not entirely unlike other gimmicky multiplayer shooters, and the microtransactions in a paid game are annoying, Knockout City is definitely worth checking out if you find the concept intriguing. But game developers, in the future, please try to avoid this particular menu UI. Fall Guys, Worms Rumble, Rocket Arena, Fortnite, and about a million other multiplayer games use this exact layout, and it's getting kinda old. Super Sammy Roll is a game I desperately want to recommend more strongly than I really can. As an indie game that costs $15 and regularly goes on sale for under $10, the value here is amazing. In this game, you play as a dragon traversing a vast world by platforming your way to defeat an evil monkey. Simple plot, simple game. Sammy can roll around, jump, bounce on the ground for extra momentum, and fling himself forward with a tongue grapple. And the first couple of worlds are absolutely incredible. The sense of speed, tricky platforming, and insane amount of variety in both level themes and enemy types is astounding. Even the music is stupendously fun, bouncy, and high energy. The controls are loose, but handle well enough to get the job done. It's only when you get partway through World 3 that things take a turn downhill. These stages require a level of precision that stops the fun of the game in its tracks. It showcases just how inconsistent and inaccurate the tongue grapple can be, and the slippery controls make things more frustrating than fun. If timers were only relegated to certain levels or checkpoints were more plentiful, these problems could have been ignored, but as it stands, the game goes from a fun mix of Sonic, Mario, and Super Monkey Ball to one that values challenge over fun. And again, my issue isn't with the game being difficult, but rather the imprecise controls and strict level design taking away from the fun in the later half. On the bright side, I can actually give it a recommendation for the fun you'll have in the first half, which is worth the asking price all on its own. And if you don't mind some sloppy controls making things frustrating later on, or just love a tough challenge, Super Sammy Roll is a game you should check out. Personally, I can't wait to see what Sonzai Games has in store for us next. If there's one word to describe Before Your Eyes, it would be unique. The game is centered around a brand new mechanic utilizing the player's webcam to track their eyes. Every time the player blinks, it's registered as a mouse click. It's not perfect every time, but it is infinitely more successful than I ever would have imagined. The game itself is more like an interactive movie, with the player occasionally being able to make choices or discover new details by looking around with the mouse and clicking with a blink. I won't spoil anything since Before Your Eyes is relatively short at 2 hours or so, but the premise is that you experience the life of the protagonist through their eyes, with each blink being a jump forward in time of varying length. While the story itself isn't for everyone, it is relatively well written, but the draw of the game has more to do with how the central mechanic influences the way in which you experience the story. I don't really have trouble with staring contests, but there were still moments in this game where I would want to see what comes next, but blink right as a conversation reached its peak, or times I would accidentally blink twice in a row and miss an entire story sequence. These moments were rare, but helped to bring more meaning to the moments I was actually able to experience. That said, despite its short length, Before Your Eyes does have some boring sequences, and while that can be kind of the point, the pacing was often really inconsistent. The game will prevent you from blinking to move forwards, sometimes resulting in a blink as soon as the prompt appears. Your choices also don't really matter much in the long run, which is pretty frustrating. And the ending, while intriguing and heartfelt, never really went that extra step to become something I'd call truly gripping. As such, Before Your Eyes is no masterpiece, but it's a truly special and unique experience that you won't be able to get anywhere else, and serves as a perfect proof of concept for a more expanded application of the blinking mechanic in the future. If you're looking for a game that's unlike any other with a story that has true passion behind it, definitely give Before Your Eyes a look. Maquette is a difficult game to discuss. The core concept is amazing and incredibly well made. In each level, you're essentially in the center of a fractal, an infinitely repeating sequence of objects in 3D space. By moving objects from the smaller central hub to the real world and vice versa, you can cause them to shrink and grow. Throughout the game, you'll come upon a bunch of puzzles that need to be solved with these tools, typically to access new areas. The team often utilizes the full potential of the mechanic, with a lot of wow moments that make the player feel accomplished for figuring things out. The story covering the life of a couple is also pretty touching, if a bit generic. Unfortunately, Maquette also has a bunch of little issues that hold it back from being anything spectacular. Moving the objects around can be really finicky and annoying, making some puzzle solutions seem improbable purely because placing the pieces you need to progress can be such a nightmare. When small, it can take ages to move between the large structures littering the environment, and I feel that giving the player a run button could have gone a long way towards alleviating that frustration. It's also really short, and many puzzles are more about asking the player where to go instead of how to get there, with very few examples of the game actually teaching a new mechanic before players are asked to figure it out. And when the controls are difficult to use, asking the player to get creative with them becomes an exercise in frustration, especially with all of the bugs. Maquette is a unique game that I definitely recommend to those who got it for free on PS Plus, but otherwise I hope the developers can better utilize this concept in future games, cause this one's just alright. Riders Republic is a game suffering from an identity crisis. It can't seem to make up its mind about being a single-player extreme sports game with exploration elements, or an online multiplayer experience. It starts off with a pretty funny cutscene and then dumps the player into a massive map with a set of starter events to compete in. Along the way, you'll run into other players also roaming the map, and it can often lend a sense of community to exploring. Unfortunately, there's no proximity chat or real ways to interact with other players, so it's all superficial. You can race against them, but it's mostly ghosts, so the game just pairs you up with whoever got the best times for your difficulty setting. It makes races feel more realistic as you watch other players screw up, but also less engaging since it's really just a time trial with fancy effects. Hell, half the events still pushed my player rank up even if I came in last place. It kinda takes the challenge away, which would be fine if the game were truly a multiplayer experience, but this in-between area makes neither aspect of its design fulfilling. It's a real shame because the sports are a blast. Bike races, doing tricks on skis and snowboards, flying through the air in a wingsuit or a jetpack, and the huge number of special events that have you using everything from snowmobiles to an ice cream delivery bike. They all control exceptionally well and make for a ton of fun event matches. Oddly enough, the worst controls in the game have to do with walking and running, but there are some other issues. For example, when biking, you can't move backwards. Also, speeding up is done by pressing R2, but that's also one of the buttons for performing tricks, making things unnecessarily unintuitive. There are also moments where the camera will stay focused on a turn you've already completed, or a tree will be just around a tight corner, meaning you have no time to react before wiping out. So while there could be improvements made, it's still a solid sports title. Unfortunately, it's also a Ubisoft sports title. The map is littered with side objectives that are a chore to hunt down, and they're revealed so slowly that later on you'll be backtracking to old areas to find the ones you've missed. Then there's the store. There are only a few items available to purchase at a time, and most of them can only be purchased with real money that can't be earned in-game. If Riders Republic were a free-to-play game, that'd be fine, but now it feels like money earned from leveling up and winning events is useless by comparison. It's just standard Ubisoft greed and prioritizing size over depth, getting in the way of the game itself, which is a real shame because at its core, Riders Republic is a great game that deserves much better. Blue Fire is one of the most perplexing games I've ever played. An impressive mix of Zelda, Hollow Knight, and Mario Sunshine, it's ambitious to say the least. An open-world platformer in which the player is tasked with cleansing the land of corruption by defeating godlike beings, all while collecting money and items to upgrade their abilities. This is a game that I absolutely hated at first, with the slow pacing and unintuitive controls being really bothersome, especially when certain mechanics aren't fully explained. Still, I stuck with it, and by the 90-minute mark, I was starting to see some of the better aspects to the game, and by the end, I can honestly say I was having a really good time. See, at first you don't have a lot of traversal abilities, making it difficult to estimate whether or not certain areas are even accessible on the first trip through. By the end, however, you're basically a superhero blasting through all these previously daunting obstacle courses. However, even when the game got to its best parts, the amount of backtracking, middling optimization, camera issues, frustrating level design, and repetitive enemies and bosses do bring the experience down from time to time. The peaks and valleys of the game's best and worst parts flip back and forth constantly, but in the end, I'd say it's a fun time overall. Not for everyone, but if you really like its inspirations, I recommend giving Blue Fire a shot. I'm gonna be honest here, I didn't play this one for long. My best friend is a massive Radiohead fan, so when I heard that they were releasing a game specifically designed to show off some crazy visuals set to songs from some of the band's most beloved albums, I got her over to my place and handed her the controller to try it out as soon as possible. I'm not the biggest Radiohead fan, but for a free museum sending players into different rooms with insane visuals set to music, the Kid A Amnesia exhibition really had me hooked. Each room was a unique marvel that, if nothing else, convinced me that I would kill to have a game with this kind of creativity in the art direction or one being scored by Radiohead, and it left my friend sitting on the couch with a massive smile saying she could die happy. If you're a Radiohead fan who hasn't given this a shot, you're doing yourself a disservice, and even if you're not into the band, it's still worth checking out for the visuals alone. Now if we could just get a game set to OK Computer... I'm officially convinced that Camelot, developer behind many titles in the Mario Sports series, has no direction in their development. After the middling 2018 release of Mario Tennis Aces, I noted the game was fun, but pretty bare bones with a story mode that was drawn out and boring, while the actual tennis was too basic to feel like a true Mario Tennis game. Now take everything I just said and replace the racket with a club. You've got Mario Golf Super Rush. On the surface, it's difficult to pick out anything particularly wrong with the game. The controls are fine, the graphics are okay, if a bit basic and with the occasional pop-in, the roster is wide, and there are a few new game modes that have a ton of potential, but as fun as some of these modes can be, the game itself is a massive missed opportunity. It seems that rather than lean into the wackiness expected of a Mario sports game, Camelot has once again opted for improving the core golfing gameplay instead, with new methods of adding spin, an inability to see the ball's trajectory to make the shot estimation feel more realistic, and a more subdued course design missing all of the game-changing shortcuts and abilities that were in Toadstool Tour. Even the animations are subdued, something incredibly apparent when they're put side by side with the previous games. The big new addition this time around is Speed Golf, in which players race to complete a hole as fast as possible, with each stroke adding 30 seconds and each character having their own special abilities that make things more difficult for other players. This can get really intense with a friend, though it does disappointingly limit local multiplayer to just 2 players. The tension felt when racing after a ball and sinking that chip in as your opponent was lining up their putt is the most excitement a Mario Golf game has had in years. However, thanks to the lack of variety mentioned earlier, that fun factor soon wears off. The other titles in the series weren't about making the golfing difficult, but rather utilizing overpowered abilities and course tricks to make a consistently exciting experience in which players could turn around a match at any moment with a particularly surprising or unique idea. Victory was about creativity and strategy more than execution. That's not to say that a game in the series couldn't be successful with a heavier focus on the actual golfing, and Super Rush is still a very fun game, but there are already plenty of golf games on the market for those looking to have a realistic golfing experience. When compared to them, this game doesn't have the depth in its core gameplay to match its competitors, and it doesn't have the unique fun of its predecessors to stand out. Mario Golf Super Rush is an acceptable golfing game that can be fun, even in the overly bloated yet surprisingly challenging single-player adventure, but with its lack of innovation and gameplay diversity, it falls just short of the green. Marvel video games have had a lot of ups and downs in recent years. There's been the absolutely stellar Spider-Man games from Insomniac, but also the painfully mediocre Avengers game from last year. So when I saw that another Marvel game was being made by Square Enix, my hopes weren't all that high, especially since the player can only act as Star-Lord, can hover at best instead of flying around the battlefield, and has to give commands to the team instead of actually getting to play as any of these diverse characters. And what we got was one of the most frustrating yet compelling games I've ever played. Everything in Guardians of the Galaxy is incredibly close to being amazing, but falls just short, making for a good, enjoyable game with some obvious and glaring faults. Playing as Star-Lord is incredibly unique, since it really feels like leading a squad. Your power doesn't come from your abilities, but rather your ability to lead the team. You can even get upgrades to different members of the group by acquiring XP through battles and finding hidden mechanical parts around the environment. While the battles are an exhilarating experience, many of them do boil down to just mashing everyone's ability rather than truly thinking about the best course of action. With 4 characters each having 4 abilities, none of which really feel all that different aside from their ultimates, you spend more time in combat ordering them around rather than fighting. Plus, it's incredibly easy to max out abilities and perks 2/3 of the way through the story, making each future combat encounter feel like it has less meaning, particularly since the game is surprisingly easy. There's also the lame and repetitive huddle-ups in which the team gathers and Star-Lord has to choose the best speech to rally everyone together. It may start off a sick sequence where cooldowns are lessened and a kick-ass song plays in the background, but it would have been better to just have Star-Lord shout out a funny battle cry instead of halting combat entirely. The story, on the other hand, is fantastic. Easily one of the funniest games I've ever played, with each character being interesting and engaging to interact with. Making choices in dialogue that can improve your odds of success or just lead to a more fun conversation is a blast, and the emotional moments hit pretty hard as well. In fact, while I've only seen the MCU films, this is easily my favorite Guardians of the Galaxy story. Not to mention the incredibly imaginative and beautifully designed alien planets. And of course, the soundtrack is unbeatable. A best of the 80s playlist blasting through the combat sequences is indescribably cool, and the score is also really solid composition work. Though all of that would be much more fun if it weren't for the constant glitches. Screen tearing, graphical glitches, being locked out of movement, incorrect inputs, Guardians just standing around instead of fighting, annoying controls when sliding into your doom or telling others what to do, and no less than 5 softlocks that forced me to restart at an earlier checkpoint in order to proceed. Even the excellent music and dialogue get muddled under each other with some god-awful sound mixing, and characters constantly talking over one another or getting interrupted by gameplay sequences. It's not Cyberpunk on PS4 levels of broken, but it does hinder an otherwise fun experience and makes the game feel almost unfinished. Still, with a bit more tidying up, some tweaks to the gameplay style, and a continuation of the excellent writing, I'll be looking out and looking forward to another adventure with this ragtag group of heroes for hire down the road. I have to be honest, I hate the way Super Mario 3D World controls. There's just something about building up run speed, the power-ups either being exploitable or useless, and the octagonal direction that just doesn't vibe with me. Which is strange since Mario's other 3D outings are some of my favorite games ever made. So when I say that Bowser's Fury is a delight to play from start to finish, you know it's going to be a blast. Taking the items, platforming, and aesthetic of 3D World and bundled into the re-release, Bowser's Fury turns all of it into an open-world collectathon. Bowser's been corrupted by some black sludge, and so Bowser Jr. enlists Mario for help, and together the two travel around this small world, unlock the 3 Gigabells, and bring Bowser back from the brink. This is done by traveling around to different islands looking for cat shrines. It only takes about 4 hours to 100%, but it's a fantastic addition to the 3D World package. There are some flaws, like having Bowser interrupt every 5 minutes being more of a chore than a threat after the first couple of times, needing to unlock Bowser blocks in every single level, some of the 3D World platforming not perfectly translating to an open world game, the frame rate noticeably dropping quite a few times, and the difficulty being non-existent for a bit too long, but a lot of that is overshadowed by the conveniences added, like having Plessy spawn in a ton of different locations, meaning you rarely have to swim back to shore, or the fast travel unlocked after beating the final boss. Not to mention, this game has one of the few completionist rewards that's actually worth the effort. All in all, this experiment clearly paid off in making an otherwise overpriced re-release worth the cost of admission, and in carving a path for how Mario's levels could be designed from here on out. If you're interested, and especially if you haven't played 3D World yet, it's an easy game to recommend. Well, this is a game I spent way longer playing than I had ever expected to when first installing it. Nerds Online is just free-to-play competitive solitaire. All the rules are the same as when playing solo, but everyone playing shares the same pool for placing cards. When a player's set of face-down cards is empty, they can call nerds, forcing everyone to gain points for every card placed into the pool, and lose points for every card left in their corner pile. It's such a simple concept, but the game is incredibly addicting and well made, likely owing to its developer being Zachtronics of Infinifactory fame. I'm not kidding when I say Nerds has been responsible for some of the most tense gameplay experiences I've had in a while, and as I mentioned from the start, the game is 100% free. You can unlock different card backs by purchasing other Zachtronics games, but otherwise there's no monetization whatsoever. If you know the rules of Solitaire, this is a game I think just about everyone should try at least once just for the novelty. Who knows, you may wind up loving it as much as I have. The indie platformer scene has really picked up in recent years. The trend started in part by 2017's A Hat in Time is still going strong with the publisher Gears for Breakfast releasing Here Comes Nico in 2021. This game is pure joy. A 3-hour-long game in which you help Nico to get a job as a professional friend. Just go around and befriend the townsfolk by helping them out, playing a game together, or just listening to what they have to say. The controls are incredibly fluid and responsive, and while they do lack precision at times, the missions are never demanding enough to warrant complaint. This game is more about exploration and figuring out what the residents of each island want rather than actually executing the task. The tasks in question do repeat a bit more than I'd like, especially for such a short game, but they're never dull or tedious. Which reminds me, the levels are a delight, well designed and the perfect size to prevent slow treks from one place to another, though some do blend together aesthetically. Speaking of aesthetics, I love the Paper Mario-esque art style along with the colorful, happy world. While it does have a lot of graphical bugs, they never get in the way of the gameplay. However, the best thing about Nico is that it respects your time. Over the years, I've covered many indie games, and even AAA titles that feel the need to pad out their runtime with mundane tasks or by slowing down certain sections of the game, hoping that the player won't notice and making their product worse as a result. Nico never feels bloated for a second, and I truly respect that. While the rough edges are there, Here Comes Nico is an absolute delight of a game that I can recommend to anyone looking for a new 3D platformer. Deathloop was one of those games that popped up on the radar every once in a while and always had me intrigued. The game looked like Dishonored with a stronger focus on action, the time loop mystery seemed like a fresh take on the roguelike genre, and it was hard to ignore given that it showed up in nearly every PlayStation State of Play since the PS5's launch. It even won some Game of the Year awards, and yeah, it's a good time, just maybe not as good as the hype would make you believe. Deathloop centers around Colt, former head of security for the Eon program, stuck in a time loop with the only way out to kill all 7 visionaries in charge of a program in a single day. He's harassed over the phone by Juliana, the only other person able to remember the events of each day, who sends copies of herself out into the world to stop Colt's efforts. As the game goes on, you'll find new information and learn more about the day-to-day goings-on of Black Reef Island, slowly piecing together a strategy for taking down the visionaries and breaking the loop. Deathloop offers plenty of opportunities to try out new ideas and experiment with its engaging combination of stealth and combat gameplay mixed with supernatural powers similar to the Dishonored titles. Sneaking through a complex and flooding an area before slipping out is tense and gratifying, but so is blasting your way through a group of unsuspecting NPCs one by one. However, nothing is more tense than being invaded by another player and needing to defeat them in order to continue with your mission. Not to mention playing as Juliana, while frustratingly underpowered at first and taking way too long to find a world to invade, offers its own unique brand of exciting confrontations and strategies. So where does Deathloop fall short? Well, it's the little things. The first-person platforming is still janky as hell and led to more deaths than I'm comfortable with. The arsenal is overpowered far too early and silenced weapons make stealth pathetically easy. The game gets repetitive since about 1/3 of the missions send you to Updom and leave the other 3 areas of the island feeling neglected. The AI is far too easy to exploit with doors and other simple tricks, and far too much of the story is told through written passages instead of in-game moments, leading to a story that's too sparse without reading everything, and poorly thought out when you do. Hell, thanks to the overt objective markers that pop up anytime you make progress in a mission, I spent a lot of my playtime chasing after orange diamonds on the map without fully understanding why. It takes away any fun the player might get out of solving the puzzle and turns this time loop mystery into a straightforward action game. Deathloop isn't really a mystery game or a roguelike. It's a semi-linear action-stealth hybrid that excels in its moment-to-moment experiences, but fails to truly live up to its potential. A solid foundation that can be built upon in the future, and definitely still a game I can recommend to fans of the Dishonored games and other similar experiences, just one that's better when you go in knowing what to expect. In 2017, Little Nightmares was a surprise hit from Tarsier Studios, combining the quick reaction puzzle platforming from games like Limbo and Inside with a creepy Burton-esque atmosphere and visual design to create a truly unique and unnerving experience. 4 years later, and we now have Little Nightmares 2, following a different character, Mono, as he makes his way through a derelict world filled with even more disturbing creatures and tricky puzzles. As far as the core gameplay goes, it's largely more of the same. Run through a few levels, solving puzzles and avoiding enemies, with each area introducing a new gameplay mechanic that's used to its fullest and then subsequently thrown out. The controls can still be a bit janky when climbing or finding the correct angle to reach a rope, but the game does better utilize the 3D nature of the environment to its advantage when designing puzzles and gameplay, really forcing the player to analyze the entire environment in order to progress over the course of their 4 to 5 hour playthrough. While progression is less cohesive than in the original, the sequel does have an even more terrifying atmosphere, with the animations and graphics going above and beyond what one would expect from such a small studio, able to give chills and frights despite the nearly complete absence of jump scares, which is always a plus. Basically, if you enjoyed the original, you'll love this one as well, and I personally can't wait to see what comes next out of this twisted, yet irresistibly intriguing universe. Since the PS5's announcement, gamers have been eagerly awaiting a true next-gen experience, a new game built from the ground up for the console, taking full advantage of the new hardware. Sony's promise was that Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart would fulfill those desires, utilizing the SSD to travel between dimensions on a moment's notice, using the adaptive triggers to change how guns are fired, and of course, looking like a Pixar-quality movie both in cutscenes and during gameplay. It's still being used in ads to this day, constantly shown off as the next-gen title to sell the concept behind the PS5. So does it succeed? Pretty much. Rift Apart starts off with Ratchet & Clank separated after Dr. Nefarious steals the Dimensionator, sending all three into a new dimension where his counterpart rules with an iron fist. Clank is soon found by Ratchet's counterpart, Rivet, and the three set off on a new adventure to stop Dr. Nefarious and reunite the friends. Having played the PS4 reboot for the first time this year, then immediately hopping into the sequel, I can confidently say two things. If you've enjoyed any of the previous games in the series, you're gonna love Rift Apart. But if Ratchet & Clank wasn't your thing before, this game isn't likely to change your mind. And that's not a bad thing, it's just that Rift Apart is the pinnacle of the series and stays true to its identity. The gunplay is punchy and gives players a unique arsenal to play around with, the platforming is fluid, the graphics are astounding, and the story is a fun little adventure through the dimensions. Fighting through hordes of baddies and exploring levels for collectibles are equally fun endeavors, only aided by the PS5's upgraded hardware. There's also Gary, and I love Gary. The game does have some problems, such as the extremely slow platforming with the magnet boots and some guns being kind of a joke even after paying tons of bolts for them later on, but the biggest issue is Sargasso. This planet gives players the ability to explore the entire map from the outset, showing islands in the poisonous swamp on the map. But it's full of lies. These islands are either empty or in some cases completely bugged out with invisible walls and intangible floors. The fact that the designers didn't anticipate players trying to explore for collectibles here is dumbfounding, and caused me to waste an hour just to learn that later the player comes back and more of these places are fleshed out. Other planets do have similar issues on occasion, but Sargasso is where it was at its worst. Just a strange design flaw for such an experienced development team. That aside, Rift Apart is still my favorite Ratchet & Clank game thus far, and I have no qualms about calling it a must-own title for the PS5. As I mentioned in the intro, this year I was fortunate enough to play the original Psychonauts for the first time. Collectathon platformer is my favorite genre of game, and while certain aspects of the design are dated, Psychonauts holds up incredibly well to this day. A fun cast of characters, a bunch of unique minds to explore, and a creative mix of acrobatic platforming mixed with psychic powers all come together to make it an experience like no other. At least until 2021. Because if you enjoyed the original game, Psychonauts 2, the long-awaited follow-up, is finally here, and it's exactly what you were waiting for. With Raz joining the gang of psycho spies as an intern, he must improve as a psychic, face terrible foes, and delve deep into the minds of some of the greatest psychics in the world in order to discover the mole in the Psychonauts and cure the Grand Head. All in all, despite the passage of nearly 2 decades, it's mostly more of the same. The campers are replaced with a mean group of interns, funny bits of dialogue are peppered throughout the story, and some clever new power-ups and mines to explore make the game an absolute delight. And while it's definitely a game I highly recommend, especially to fans of the original, it does feel a bit dated. I never really liked the art style of the first game, and the second is pretty similar, but now with it being in HD, the ugliness is really up close and personal, especially with the middling texture work. On the gameplay front, there are some inconveniences and slower mechanics that modern games have pretty much done away with. Some of the powers aren't quite as useful as others, or get thrown out near the end, aside from maybe 1 or 2 opportunities to find a collectible. There are also a handful of slow or broken control schemes, and it makes traversal kind of annoying at times. It feels more like a sequel that came out on the Xbox 360 that's been remastered than a true modern 3D platformer. But that said, it still feels like the remaster of an Xbox 360 classic. It's a great time, and more than anything has me hoping we don't have to wait another 16 years to jump into this wonderful and wacky world yet again. They finally did it. After years of struggling to find the right way to improve, reinvent, or reintroduce Mario Party, Nintendo has finally made the best one in the series to date. And all it took was a return to the series' roots with some quality of life improvements and some of the best minigames the series has had to offer. Mario Party Superstars brings back everything the series is known for. Chaotic gameplay centered around a board game with minigames to break up the action and get a leg up on your opponents. The best thing about this series is that it's a multiplayer game that anyone can win. While experienced players have an advantage, it's not a competitive game with balanced mechanics. Mario Party is a dumb game you boot up to have a good time with friends. The goal isn't to challenge the other players, but to have fun. After all, it's not a fight, it's a party, and Superstars understands that entirely. I could go into the mechanics further, but you know what to expect. The maps have unique themes and ideas that make each one feel different, and while I wish there were a few more, the selection is solid. The minigames are some of the best from the series past and range from complex bouts of skill and dexterity to completely random bullshit. It's just Mario Party. No frills, no gimmicks, just a good time and an excuse to have fun with friends over a few drinks. It proves that the series always had excellence baked into its core, it just needed to lean into what makes it stand out from the competition. I can't wait to see what happens in the future and where the series goes from here, because if Superstars is the result of going back to basics, I can only imagine what new ideas and innovations that build on the series' best points will bring to the table in the future. Pokemon Snap is one of my favorite games on the N64. One of the most unique games in existence, it tasked players with using their problem-solving skills and quick trigger finger to take the best pictures of Pokemon that they possibly could. To this day, I can't think of a single other game that's combined puzzle solving, first-person shooting, and quick reflexes in quite the same way. Now, over 2 decades later, Nintendo has finally released a sequel, appropriately called New Pokemon Snap, and it was absolutely worth the wait. New Pokemon Snap is, at its core, identical to the N64 title in many ways. The main objective in each level is to ride through an environment on rails, taking the best pictures of Pokemon possible, with the professor scoring your images at the end based on factors like size, positioning, and pose. Aiding in this effort are the various tools unlocked along the way, such as food to attract Pokemon, a scanner to unlock new details about the environment, and much more. The gameplay loop of going through levels, finding different Pokemon, and unlocking new types of poses with the tools is just as addicting as before. There's also a few new mechanics to keep things fresh. First is the addition of a star rating. Each Pokemon has 4 different star levels of pictures to take. Each of these is counted separately from one another and given its own score. So while getting a super rare action shot of a Pokemon will net you 4 stars, a well-shot picture of the same Pokemon in a casual pose will sometimes be worth more points. There's also the addition of research levels, unlocking new Pokemon and routes in the same environment after getting enough points. It's cool seeing how different setups in the same environments can change the gameplay, with a maxed out level often being seriously tricky to reach without the help of a guide. However, there are some issues. While the game is beautiful overall, many of the textures in the environment can be GameCube level resolution, standing out amongst the otherwise well-designed levels, and the pop-in and low frame rate in some areas is really distracting. Then there's the worst offender in the game, its pacing. New Pokemon Snap really wants to convince players that they got their money's worth, stretching what should have been a 6 to 8 hour campaign out to 12 or more. For one, players don't unlock the speed boost until the very end, meaning that until then they're stuck at the slowest speed on additional runs through a level, and those runs will be necessary since you can only submit 1 picture per Pokemon per run, not even allowing duplicates for different star levels, meaning that at least 4 runs are needed to get every kind of shot per level. The game definitely should have allowed players to at least show the professor 1 Pokemon picture per star rating, but instead forces the player to replay the same levels over and over again. With all of that said, New Pokemon Snap is still an absolute joy of a game on the whole. Despite the repetition, it's guaranteed to have you coming back for more, and making a new discovery is always worth the effort. I'm glad the series is back and can only hope that it doesn't take another 20 years for the next game to arrive. Resident Evil Village is full of surprises. With the series' roots establishing the baseline for survival horror and slowly swinging back and forth into the action genre, this is the first entry since 4 that toes the line and succeeds in nearly every way. While the game shifts itself from the nearly exclusive horror focus of RE7, the village and all of its fascinating outposts are still dripping with an uneasy atmosphere that's sure to make even the most hardcore of horror fans second-guess their decision to proceed. However, it's just as likely to push the most timid of players forward in order to continue exploring the world and experiencing the game. It takes the best parts of nearly every other game in the series and makes what I consider to be, if not the best Resident Evil game thus far, then certainly the most Resident Evil game thus far. Players will go from feeling helpless to being a true badass on a moment's notice, and vice versa. The puzzles and exploration won't leave you scratching your head or running in circles, but will provide a nice challenge. The sound design and animations are some of the best in the industry, and while some textures have resolution issues, pop-in is a common occurrence even on the PS5 version, and the voice acting ranges from emotionally gripping to cheesy B-movie schlock, the rest of the game is such a presentational masterpiece that those problems can be all but ignored. However, while the core of the village is undoubtedly enjoyable, the moment-to-moment experience can get repetitive at times. While the increase in enemy types from 7's mold monsters is appreciated, the core gameplay loop doesn't change much after entering Castle Dimitrescu. While the different areas of the map have their own themes and the occasional unique idea, it always comes down to finding a locked door, going through a linear pathway to reach the key, then continuing through the door to find the Duke's shop and a typewriter to save. Most areas are designed to be explored after reaching the next typewriter, but the lack of any surprises or respawning enemies makes the exploration aspect less engaging. And with the Duke's exorbitant prices, this exploration becomes a necessity for survival. But when it comes to the overall experience, there are enough tricks and shakeups along the way, especially in a particular dollhouse basement, to keep RE8 enjoyable from start to finish. It's clear that the developers found their footing with RE7 and wanted to make a follow-up with the only goal in mind being to give the player an unforgettably unique and fun experience, free of any kind of pretentiousness some might expect from the modern gaming industry. With a story that neatly ties things together and remains intriguing until the end, combat that functions perfectly for both the action-heavy and chills-inducing sections of the game, and a positively addicting village dripping with atmosphere and begging to be explored from top to bottom, Resident Evil Village is yet another win for the series, and I can't wait to see what kind of experience Capcom will bring us next. I fucking hate this game, is what I said numerous times throughout my constant struggles getting through Returnal, a brutally difficult bullet hell roguelike game from Housemarque. The concept is simple. Celine is an astronaut who crash lands on a dangerous planet, and every time she dies, she awakens mid-crash with the planet's layout randomized, occasionally keeping a permanent upgrade. Run through the various levels, collect items, weapons, and upgrades to improve your chances of survival, and try to break the loop. But it's the execution that really drives this concept home. Of course, part of the execution is exactly that. Constant deaths and close calls throughout the adventure, many of which are heartbreaking, but rarely, if ever, unfair. Between the light horror elements in the story and atmosphere, and the constant threat of death resetting most of your progress, the game keeps you on edge from start to finish, and it's an absolute delight. Controls are snappy, weapons are punchy, the graphics are some of the most beautiful I've seen in a game, the secrets within the various biomes are discovered and revealed organically, the choices are often incredibly difficult and make each run vary just enough to stay fresh, the boss fights are heart-pounding spectacles, the post-game content gives players more to enjoy after the credits roll. It's a nearly flawless experience. Nearly. Unfortunately, there are some problems. The story, while intriguing, teeters more towards unexplained and poorly thought out than abstract. And some details contradict one another, such as Celine only retaining memories of her previous journeys when the game starts, despite having gone through the various biomes in the past. Hell, how did she even get to the second biome without the key obtained in the first? There are also some mechanics that should have been explained more, such as Siliphium increasing your max health when you aren't damaged, or what the various weapon traits mean, like whether higher level items deal more damage, or if it's just the bonus damage modifier that matters. And of course, there's the major issue of not being able to save or quit without restarting the cycle. And I'm not talking about checkpoints, I mean simply stopping where you're at and continuing later. This means that you can't start a new file to show the game to a friend, or quit in the middle of a run to play something else, which is a problem considering that a full run can take upwards of 7 hours and an average run for me was 90 minutes. There's since been a patch that allows players to turn the console off without losing progress, which alleviates the issue a bit, but not entirely. Still, if you want to try one of the best roguelike games to come out in years, and quite possibly the most difficult game I've ever played, you should definitely give Returnal a shot. Oh, and I finished the game with 12 total deaths, so let me know in the comments if you beat my score. Normally I wouldn't discuss a community mod when talking about some of the best games to come out in a given year. While many can be fun, they're usually just neat little twists on a game's formula. But now, 10 years after the last game's release, Portal Reloaded celebrates the anniversary by crafting a brand new experience. At first, I saw the premise was about using a third portal and figured I'd check it out, thinking it would just be a cute gimmick through a couple of levels and that the positive Steam reviews were from nostalgic fans excited about having more Portal to play. Instead, this is what I would consider to be the Portal equivalent to Half-Life Alyx, and I've never been so happy to be wrong. Portal Reloaded is a 5 to 6 hour game with its own story, unique assets, and over 20 test chambers to solve. The third portal is used to travel between different times rather than 2 locations. As such, items and elements in the past will still exist in the future, but not the other way around. While it may seem like a gimmick, the incredibly clever puzzle designs are an absolute marvel and make this an experience unlike anything else in the series. Every single mechanic from the original 2 games now has to be reconsidered and relearned in order to effectively use the time travel mechanic and solve each room. And with the points in time being before and after Shell takes out GLaDOS in the first game, the facility's destruction makes for the perfect reason behind the 2 versions of the test chambers having various differences. Plus, the aesthetic difference makes it perfectly clear which timeline you're in at any given point. Portal 1 and 2 are 2 of my favorite games of all time, and to have a mod come out 10 years later that feels like a true follow-up is incredible. I genuinely believe that the quality of this mod is nearly on par with the actual games. All I can really say is that if Valve doesn't want to get off their asses and make a 3rd game themselves, they should definitely outsource the job to this team right here, because Portal Reloaded is my game of the year for 2021. Taking a look back at this year's successes and failures, I think I understand the misconception about 2021 being quote-unquote bad. While there were a ton of games that innovated and expanded their genres in new ways, there weren't really any of those 10 out of 10 masterpieces blowing anyone away. 2021 may not have been a year where a game came along and took the world by storm, but it has been a year in which anyone who plays games could find multiple excellent titles to play. The return of long-dead franchises like Pokemon Snap, Metroid, and Psychonauts, stellar continuations in Resident Evil Village, Halo Infinite, and Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, imaginative new IPs like Returnal, It Takes Two, and Deathloop, and standout indie titles such as Inscription, Before Your Eyes, and Sable. If nothing else, this year had something for everyone. There's never been a better time to get into gaming than right now. And with highly anticipated titles like Elden Ring, Horizon Forbidden West, God of War Ragnarok, and more coming next year, it's only getting better from here. Unfortunately, that's where the bad news comes. Since 2017, I've done my best to play as many notable games that came out in a given year as possible, but it's just not feasible for a single person to do with a full-time job. Hell, even financially, I spent over $800 on new games this year alone. While I'll still make a list next year, it won't be as long or extensive since I'm going to focus more on my backlog than trying to play everything 2022 has to offer, as well as getting back into game development work. The good news is, I have some games lined up that I know will make for solid retrospectives and video essays, so keep an eye out or subscribe and click the bell to be notified when those release. I can't wait to create more content for you all, so be sure to let me know your favorite games from this year and which upcoming titles have you excited in the comments below. And as always, have a mighty nifty 2022.